Today, our presenter will talk about how 25% of Saskatchewan's serious injuries, categorized by WCB, in the hospitality industry stem from violent incidences. With a sobering statistic in mind, it's crucial to examine into what exactly constitutes a violent prevention program and to understand the full scope of leadership's responsibility in safeguarding workers against such incidences. From ensuring regulatory compliance and conducting thorough risk assessments to meeting reporting requirements, we will address all the essential aspects to help you maintain a violence-free workplace. Today, we're joined by Laura Bence, who is from Service Hospitality, and I'm going to hand it over to her to do an introduction. We had a switch of presenters, so my notes aren't necessarily what Laura is. So over to you, Laura.
Perfect. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Laura Bence. I am the Senior Safety and Program Specialist with Service Hospitality. If you're not as familiar with Service Hospitality, we are one of 7 safety associations in the province of Saskatchewan here, and we are dedicated to working with businesses in the hospitality industry, so hotels, restaurants, as well as the community service industry, so things like youth care homes, disability support, shelters, and so on. So we're here today to present information specific to hotels and restaurants and other types of businesses in hospitality specifically. And with that, I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay. And we have the right one shared there, Nick?
Yeah, it looks good.
Perfect. Okay. So Service Hospitality, like I said, is one of 7 safety associations. We are funded by our employers. So we are funded through the Workers' Compensation Board in Saskatchewan here. So a very small portion of your WCB premiums come to us to fund us so that we can provide education, resources, and other services around workplace health and safety. We provide training, education, and lots of resources to over 4,100 employers in these industries in our province. And we have lots of resources and other great tools available on our website, which I will give you at the end of today's presentation. Okay. Sorry, just bear with me a second. I'm trying to get all the proper windows popped up on my screen here. Here we go. Okay, so I want to get started by looking at who I am compared to who you are in the context of today's presentation specifically. So I'm a safety advisor and you guys are industry professionals. Today's presentation is really through the lens of workplace health and safety, but I recognize that you're seeing this through your own personal lens and experiences. So what your workplace looks like to you and what your role is in every day will make your lens slightly different than what someone else's in the room might be. Through the occupational health and safety lens is where we get the definition of violence in the workplace. So the definition comes directly out of the Saskatchewan Occupational Health and Safety Regulations, and it means the attempted, threatened, or actual conduct of a person that causes or is likely to cause injury, and includes any threatening statement or behavior that gives a worker reasonable cause to believe that the worker is at risk of injury. So a couple of the key words here. So violence means attempted, threatened, or actual. So what this really translates to is even if no physical violence actually occurs, a statement or a gesture can still be considered violence, even if it's threatened. Conduct of a person that causes or is likely to cause injury. So again, this means that even if an action does not cause injury, if it was likely to, it can still be classified as violence. Includes any threatening statement or behavior. So again, a statement can be sufficient to constitute violence, and gives a worker reasonable cause to believe that the worker is at risk of injury. So even if the worker is actually not at risk, if they have reasonable cause to believe that they could be, it can be classified as workplace violence. So now that we have a better idea of what we're discussing today, let's see why this topic is actually so important in our industry. So since 2019, there have been a total of 86 assaults, violent acts, attacks, and harassment injuries in the hospitality industry in Saskatchewan reported to the Workers' Compensation Board. I think that's really key to emphasize is these are just things that are reported. How often do incidents of violence or harassment happen in our workplaces that don't get reported and result in a WCB claim? It's likely going to be quite a bit higher than this 86. On top of that, 28% of those 86 injuries resulted in serious injuries. So serious injuries is a classification that the Workers' Compensation Board uses to determine injuries that are kind of beyond what should be reasonable for someone working in that industry. It can include injuries that result in more than 50 days of missed work, result in permanent impairment, or result in a mental health or a psychological injury, among other classifications. But more than a quarter of these violence-related incidents result in serious injuries, which is important to note. 21% of these violence-related injuries resulted in psychological injuries. I think it's pretty obvious to figure out how this could happen. That means that 21% of these injuries resulted in claims with significant mental health components. So either the diagnosis right after the incident was a psychological diagnosis, such as PTSD, or a physical injury manifested eventually into a psychological injury. So it's not just a threat to our physical health and safety and well-being, but also our psychological being as well in the workplace. And again, like I said, these are only the things that are reported to WCB, but how often are incidents happening in our workplace that don't get reported, that are missing from these statistics? So what are our legal requirements as employers? Currently, employers and supervisors have the legal responsibility to protect the health and safety of their workers. This is called the general duty, and this general duty implies the requirement to keep their workers safe from violence, but doesn't necessarily mention it specifically. However, the government of Saskatchewan has recently determined that violence is a growing concern and must be stated outright, which has resulted in Bill 91 to amend the Saskatchewan Employment Act. The amendments were passed last year in May of 2023, and are enforced to Part 3 of the Occupational Health and Safety provision. In the interest of today's training, I'll introduce those new requirements. So these are the requirements that are added to sections 3-8 and 3-9 of the Saskatchewan Employment Act. And it says, employers are responsible for all workers and all matters arising out of the worker's employment. This is very broad. Ultimately, employers have the responsibility to keep workers safe. Supervisors also have responsibilities as per legislation, but theirs are a little bit more focused. So they are only responsible for workers under their direct supervision. Employers and supervisors are not the only ones who have responsibilities as it pertains to workplace violence in the workplace. Workers do as well. So before we talk about the responsibilities of workers, I just want to cover kind of a safety 101 concept. So the 3 rights of workers, These are the 3 legal rights of workers in the province of Saskatchewan, and they are the right to know about hazards in a workplace, the right to participate in health and safety activities, and the right to refuse unusually dangerous work. So, what about work that is usually dangerous? So for someone to legally refuse work, it has to be unusually dangerous. It has to be a danger that is not expected of the job, or something that someone doesn't have training to do or the proper equipment to do. But oftentimes our jobs have tasks or requirements that are just inherently dangerous. So what about work that is usually dangerous? And that's where this presentation comes in. It's not reasonable for an employer to 100% eliminate all potential of risk, nor should they. I often like to talk about how we're actually seeing a lot of people become too reliant on like safety processes, and they're not looking out for themselves anymore, which results in more serious injuries. So if we're focused on these things are all very important, but safety measures such as signage and procedures and PPE, are we still taking into account, or are we looking out for ourselves? So I heard a really great example of this about how football players actually experience more injuries and more serious injuries than rugby players, which, if you're familiar with the sports, if you watched yesterday's Super Bowl, or Usher concert as I like to call it, football players have a lot of protective gear, helmets, shoulder pads, everything, whereas rugby players have very minimal protective gear. So why is it that rugby players are injured less when it's still a very physical contact sport? The theory is that because they have less equipment, they're more aware or self-aware of keeping their bodies safe. So that's kind of the point I'm trying to make here is employers are fully responsible to eliminate risks, but they're never going to be able to eliminate 100% of risk. That's why workers have to also be aware of how to keep themselves safe. So with that said, for the risks that remain, how can your employer ensure that workers are set up to be protected and trained or educated to handle these risks? So workers have legal requirements as well when it comes to workplace, or when it comes to violence prevention. They must refrain from causing or participating in any violent act toward another worker. Workers must also take reasonable care to protect health and safety of themselves and of others. The term reasonable comes up a lot in health and safety law, and it just means that you can't do any of this with absolute certainty, but you do have the responsibility to try. And workers must refrain from causing or participating in harassment. In addition, workers also have responsibilities to report hazards in the workplace, any incidents that occur, so injuries or property damage and near misses. These include anything related to violence. They're also responsible for utilizing all of the safety controls that are in place to protect them. So if there's PPE, they should be wearing it and should be familiar with how to use it properly. They should be aware and following safety procedures, and they should be participating and following any safety training that they've received as well. And we're going to talk a lot more about safety controls a little bit later as well. So the previous slides looked at our job duties from a safety lens, but what are our other duties at work? So everyone at work has operational duties. This is what is required to essentially do the job. We also have responsibilities or duties to keep the workplace safe for everyone, not just staff. So this is going to include our guests or our customers, people who come to our establishments, use our services. Oftentimes there's going to be overlap. So I think about the example of, let's say, lighting in our parking lots. Having good, appropriate lighting in our parking lots is going to create a safer work environment for our staff, but it's also going to create a safer environment for our customers and guests as well. Also thinking of safety issues that are kind of cut and dry, that could potentially result in some kind of violent incident. So let's say you have a worker who slips on, someone spills a drink in our restaurant. You have a worker that slips on this slippery floor and bumps into a patron. The patron is intoxicated and they turn around and they get physical with the worker. So the hazard here was the spill or the slipping hazard, but it resulted in violence. So also thinking about how just kind of safety hazards could result in violent situations. We also have emotional or mental requirements of our jobs. So working with the public can take a toll on both your body and your mental health. The job-related mental health requirements may not be outlined in your job description, but it should be considered as well. So we talk about all of these things to show that there are many factors to consider, but to ensure safety in the workplace for everyone, clients, guests, customers, etc., we have to ensure it's also a safe workplace for the workers first and foremost. So how are employers supposed to do that? And this is where we talk about a violence prevention plan. So like I said, prior to May of 2023, only prescribed businesses in Saskatchewan were required to have a violence prevention plan. They were businesses such as, likely included many of you, those who serve alcohol, those who work kind of 24 hours, taxi drivers, hospitals, places like that. But it didn't necessarily include every type of business in Saskatchewan. However, as I mentioned a couple slides ago, the province did determine that every business in Saskatchewan needs to have a violence prevention plan. So it's now a legal requirement of everyone in our province. They made those amendments last year, and all businesses in our province have until May of this year, so May of 2024, to have these violence prevention plans implemented. So we're going to talk about each component of the violence prevention plan and how it is important for keeping your workplace safe from incidents of violence. So a policy statement on violence and prevention plan is required by law, and it must be in writing. Employers have to ensure that preventative measures to minimize or eliminate risks are in the policy statement and prevention plan, and that these are put into practice in the workplace to protect workers from the risk of violence. So our prevention plan has to have a statement of the employer's commitment. So a commitment to minimizing or eliminating the risks, and a commitment to including workers in developing, maintaining, or updating the policy statement and prevention plan. Usually this is done through collaborating with the OH&S committee to fulfill that requirement. And the employer must commit to providing a training program for workers. Our violence prevention plan also must identify work sites and positions that may be susceptible to incidents of violence. So workplaces must do a risk assessment to identify positions, work sites, and locations of greatest risk. Include the work sites where violent incidents have occurred or have the potential to occur. And use that risk assessment to identify who may be at risk of harm and how and where. This information is really the backbone or what is needed to decide what must be done to reduce or eliminate those risks. So we have to be able to identify them before we can work on eliminating or minimizing them. So a risk assessment that identifies all of those positions, sites, tasks, that sort of thing. And then our violence prevention plan has to have actions to eliminate the risk. So once you've identified who and where is at risk, use that information to develop preventative measures which will minimize and eliminate the risk of violence to workers. Measures can include practices or precautions, policies, procedures, or physical controls. If they're not already in place or you have controls that aren't being used or working properly, they may need to be developed or revised or implemented. Workers also will need training and education on anything new that is introduced. Again, we'll talk about controls a lot later, but something that comes to mind is, especially in hotels, you'll often see two kinds of areas at a check-in desk. You'll see hotels that have like the individual kind of pods with the front desk agent checking in guests, and you'll see hotels that have kind of the just flush desk with no entry for members of the public. There's obviously pros and cons from a business perspective for both of those types of kind of front desk environments. However, this is kind of something you need to think about when we're thinking about violence prevention, is how likely is a desk that is that completely kind of separates the staff from the guests, how likely is that to protect workers from violence versus the individual pod style of check-in desks. So just an example of things you'd want to think about as far as, work sites that may contribute to workplace violence or controls to put in place. Our violence prevention plan also must have procedures for reporting. So there has to be a way for our workers or staff to report any incidents of violence that they are exposed to. So the procedures must be in place for reporting violence, violent near misses, or potential hazards or risks. They should enable workers to report any incidents of violence or theft to managers or supervisors, including threats and physical acts of violence. And in addition to having these procedures, workers must be trained to know how and when to do so. So it's only so good to have procedures for reporting. Our workers actually have to know that they exist and how to use them. We also need to have procedures for investigations. So a procedure for investigation should state how the employer will document and investigate these incidents. Provide sufficient information and explanation to workers on how to complete incident report forms. Include the OHC, so the Occupational Health and Safety Committee, in the investigation and review of the incident, and provide procedures to the OHC as well to recommend corrective action needed to prevent a recurrence. The employer is the one who decides which corrective actions to accept and to implement. And lastly, our violence prevention plan must include procedure on post-incident support. So it should contain measures to help workers cope with injuries and post-traumatic incident stress arising from violent incidents, and contain a recommendation that any worker exposed to a violent incident consult their physician for treatment or referral for post-incident counseling. So that's a requirement taken right out of legislation that has to be in our violence prevention plan. And for good reason, right? We looked at the stats and we saw how many violent incidents result in psychological injuries. This piece is really important for that reason. The last requirement on your violence prevention plan is training. So training should include information about hazard recognition, so how to recognize potentially violent situations, hazard controls, so what are the procedures, what are the work practices, the administrative arrangements, or engineering controls that have been developed to protect your workers. Training on response, so how to respond to violent incidents and obtain assistance. And training on reporting. So what are the procedures for reporting violent incidents, near misses, and specific risk factors? So just a question to ponder. You don't have to put this in the chat box by any means, but just based on what we have discussed so far, how confident are you in your organization's violence prevention processes? Do you have a document that outlines all of these things that we have talked about so far? So we're going to circle back to the risk assessment because that's really kind of the biggest piece that needs to be done as part of putting together a violence prevention plan. So to determine all the information required on your violence prevention plan, you need to conduct that risk assessment. Depending on your role in the organization, your involvement may differ a little, but a thorough risk assessment just includes feedback from all areas of the organization, including worker groups such as the Occupational Health and Safety Committee, like I mentioned. The government of Saskatchewan does have a guide titled Violence Prevention, an employer's guide to developing a policy statement and prevention plan. This outline follows along with that guide. That's also a really great resource. I encourage everyone to look that up for kind of a very comprehensive guide to put something like this together. So when you begin your assessment, the first thing to do is gather information. So begin by reflecting on past incidents. You can look at past incident reports, first aid reports, or OHC records, guides, policies, and procedures, worker surveys, if you've done those in the past, if they might have helpful information, or even affiliated umbrella organizations or industry associations. So obviously Tourism Saskatchewan would be a great resource. Trade associations you might be a part of, or your safety association. Like I said, if you're a hospitality organization, you're automatically a member of Service Hospitality. You're already paying for our services through your WCB premium. So we always recommend coming to us if you have questions or need assistance with stuff like this. From those past incidents, you want to make note of the location that the incidents happened in, the nature and circumstances of the work in the incident, workplace locations or job classifications or positions affected. If there's any repeated patterns, so time of day or job duty or locations, do you see those things repeat? That can be a really good clue. Frequency of these incidents, how often are they happening? Then you want to assess your current state. So review some other factors in more detail, such as the workers who were impacted. What kind of training had they received? Were they new workers or more experienced workers? You can consider factors such as their age, gender, demeanor, personalities, and attitudes. Those can give you clues into what may have contributed to a violent situation. The nature of the work environment, so the physical layout of the space, what kind of signage, what kind of lighting is in place. Again, when I talked about the hotel check-in space or front desk area, that's a good example of kind of looking at your current state. And administrative practices that you have in place. So do you have processes or procedures for working safely alone, locking up or handling cash or alcohol? If it's going to be a value, I always recommend expanding your review beyond the information gathering and assessing your current state. So look back further than just the last year or so, looking back 5 to 10 years for records of violent incidents. So again, compile all of that information and look for trends. Is the frequency of incidents increasing? When and where are they happening? What positions are impacted the most? Are circumstances similar or repeated? Are there common factors? What policies or practices or procedures were in place at the time? And did staff know about them? Were they used or were they used appropriately? These are all going to give you clues into how to create a workplace that's safe from violence. And then conduct a comparison. So you can also look for historical information on violence occurring in similar places of employment or within the same industry. So find other workplaces with similar experiences, or look at the experience of the industry. Identify and list the preventative measures, practices, or precautions and policies that are suited to and capable of reducing or eliminating each identified risk. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some of these risk factors in more detail. Risk factors are really any variable in your organization that increases the risk, and in this case, it's going to be the risk of violence. For the purpose of this presentation, I've grouped them into 3 categories. So first of all, the physical environment. What do you think are some aspects of the physical environment in and around a workplace that could make it more susceptible to violent incidents? We've talked about the layout of our spaces. We've talked about lighting, maintenance and upkeep, parking lots or external spaces around our buildings, access, control to spaces such as elevators, stairwells, washrooms, general building design, what security equipment do we have installed, and even what neighborhood our business is located in is going to be, could contribute to a risk factor. And then there's the operational category. So these are risk factors coming directly from the types of operations, such as handling cash or valuables may increase the risk of violence. Interacting with members of the public, we know, certainly increases the risk of violence in a workplace. Working alone or in isolation. So if you have the night auditors who work the night shift at a hotel, or if you have housekeepers who are working in isolation, cleaning rooms, the risk of violence can go up if they're working alone. And of course, serving alcohol, we know, increases the risk of violence in a workplace. So assessing kind of your operational risk factors will give you clues too. And organizational factors. So these are factors coming from the specific organization itself and can include things such as policies or training, or more likely a lack of policy. If you don't have those things in place, your risk of violence goes up. Operating while understaffed, especially like during meal times, if it's in a restaurant, or when visitors or the public are welcome. High worker turnover can increase the risk of violence. It's just harder to kind of retain that knowledge to prevent violence, or even new or young workers. Or if we have inadequate security or assistance personnel, that may be a factor that could increase the risk of violence. So these are really just some high-level examples. We'll do a little bit of a activity. I know we can't really do an activity in this format, but just to get our minds kind of thinking more about how to do a risk assessment. So, So I have provided a handout to Nick. I think Nick will have, I'm not sure if that was sent out prior to the presentation or if it will be sent out following, but I sent essentially a sample risk assessment sheet with potential risks as well as sample controls for each of those risks. You'll find the activity I'm about to go through, you'll find those examples on that sheet, but this is just to kind of get us thinking about it. Oops. So I'll pop up something that might be a risk in our organization, and I just want to think about what kind of controls we could put in place for that particular risk. So one of the things we'd want to assess as a workplace is, can workers call for immediate help when workplace violence occurs or is likely to occur? This is something you'd want to ask yourself while doing your violence risk assessment at your workplace. If the answer is no, what kinds of controls could you put in place to rectify this? There's always going to be more than one option. Some will be easy to implement, some might be difficult, some might be costly, some might not cost anything at all. It's really up to the organization to determine kind of what's reasonable and what's required to keep our workers safe from violence. So this is an example of a couple, or these are a few examples of something you could put in place for this particular risk. So providing equipment to summon assistance, like fixed alarms or cell phones. I've worked with a couple hotels that have like neat name badges that have little buttons that you can press that will call for assistance right away. Providing GPS tracking devices. This is more so for organizations that maybe have workers who go from location to location, but if you employ your own delivery drivers, this might be something you'd like to implement. or would be a solution for this particular risk. Providing numbers for workers to call at all hours of operation, so whether that's emergency assistance or managers on duty, probably both. And establishing an internal code to indicate that help is needed. So this might be something you could implement at a restaurant or a hotel or another establishment. So again, a couple options here for this particular risk. Some of these would be really easy and really affordable to implement. Some of these would probably be a little bit more difficult and a little bit more costly to implement. But again, you want to determine what is the level of risk to your workers. And if the risk is high, then oftentimes you look for those more kind of significant hazard controls. Here's another example. So are workers trained to recognize and deal with potentially violent people, situations, or high-risk locations? If your answer is no, think about putting together, and again, training, when I say training, it doesn't have to be outsourced. You don't have to hire someone to come in and train your staff. This is training that you can put together on your own internally and roll it to your staff. So training could include how workers will be informed about potentially violent situations, signs of behavior escalation. This is a really good piece of education to share with workers. Recommended actions and reactions, including when to leave or how to escape violent situations. Or appropriate response incidents, including diffusing hostile behaviors. So again, especially places like restaurants or bars or lounges, even front desk agents. I did my time as a front desk agent many years ago, and this is really valuable information for staff in those roles. So again, training could be formal training. You could hire someone, you could outsource training, you could create the training program internally. But we should remember onboarding training, of course, when we have new staff come on, but also refresher training, right? Making sure people remember it, including it in safety moments. If you have little just stand-up meetings or even in staff meetings, just bring it up. Always finding those opportunities to kind of provide that micro learning throughout someone's employment, not just right after they're hired. Workers' roles, typically it's going to be the employer, manager, that kind of role who puts together a violence prevention plan and the training, but workers should be involved as well. So what does this look like specifically? Workers are going to be really valuable at providing information about job specifics. So what are their personal experiences based on their input? Like how likely do they think things are likely to occur? They can give feedback on controls that are already in place. So maybe there's this safety control that's in place that isn't really working as intended. Workers can also let their supervisors know, if they aren't working, they should be letting the supervisors know, maybe give suggestions on what could be done instead, and provide that feedback. Seeing how we are for time, I think we're right on the nose here. The last thing that's really important in a violence prevention program is that reporting. So I mentioned that earlier. This needs to be really well fleshed out in order for it to work well. So first of all, we need to know, all staff need to know, who are they reporting to? So who are they reporting violent incidents to? This should be outlined in your organization's specific policies and procedures. As a general rule, probably to someone's immediate supervisor, but that might depend on the organization. What needs to be reported? So oftentimes workers will know, like, if someone punches me, if I get physically assaulted at work, I'm going to report it. But do your workers know that they should also be reporting near misses or potential for dangerous situations? So make sure that's really clear. We should also know when to report. So oftentimes, especially when we're working at a place like a restaurant, It's busy, we're on our feet. There's not a lot of time to sit down and fill out a report. It's really important to emphasize to our staff that reporting these things is important and should be done immediately, even if that means stepping off the floor for 5 minutes. Making sure our workers know to report immediately or as soon as they can. Even if that danger, that situation is passed, reporting quickly is going to ensure that an investigation can be done right away and implementation of new controls can be put in place quickly. The goal of reporting and investigating so quickly is to make sure that the same situation doesn't reoccur or happen again. We can put controls in place before that happens. How to report. Again, maybe workers are like, oh, I was told I should report, but I don't know. Am I supposed to fill out a form? Is it on the computer? Is it in someone's desk? How do I report it? So again, this should be outlined in your organization's policies and procedures. Like maybe it's a specific form electronically or a paper form that needs to be filled out. And is there another way? So what this is insinuating is, what if it's your supervisor who is the one acting in a violent manner? Then what? What's the alternative? Workers need to be familiar with the alternative as well. So what do you do if you don't feel comfortable talking to your supervisor? Is there another supervisor or another manager you can go to? If it's serious enough, do workers know they can contact the police or even the Occupational Health and Safety Division? If it's related to discrimination, even the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission can be contacted. And there's always the option of consulting legal advice as well. So now that we've fully walked through these formal processes to keep workers safe at work, let's finish off our time today by talking about things that you can do to keep yourself safe. So there are a number of ways that you can be better prepared to keep yourself safe at work, prepared to respond and react to threats of violence in the workplace and outside of work as well. So first is using your intuition. Intuition, or that gut feeling that we all experience, is defined as the art of knowing without having all of the evidence. So intuition doesn't tell us why, it only tells us what. So what are we afraid of? What are we uneasy about? It doesn't tell us the why. A really interesting fact, human beings are the only species that override our intuition. Every other species on the planet follows their intuition. That's how they survive. But humans prefer logical and grounded decisions, which end up in a supportable conclusion. Intuition, for the most part, will act in our best interests and is always in response to something. So, the gazelle is following their intuition that maybe there's a lion nearby they need to get away from. Just like, if I'm stepping into an elevator and there's an individual there who's giving me kind of a gut feeling, that's my intuition responding to something. So it's not necessarily about overreacting to something in front of us or a situation. It's just about understanding and awareness. So when we're triggered or when we feel that gut feeling, it's prudent to shift that feeling from the subconscious to the conscious and think, why have I been triggered and what is going on here that I need to pay attention to? So just being mindful of our intuition can help keep us safe in potentially violent situations. I'll fly through the next couple points here. Next is our response. So we're probably all very familiar with fight, flight, and freeze. When we're faced with a threatening situation, we immediately search our hard drive looking for parallel experiences. We want to know what happened or what worked last time and apply that behavior or strategy this time. However, making decisions in the throes of crisis is usually not a very good idea. But being taken by surprise, by being unaware is unavoidable. So that's why preparation is the third key point here. We should be prepared for how we will respond before an incident does occur. So it can be helpful to go through mental what ifs. What if someone walked into your office carrying a weapon? What if someone was acting aggressively and refused to leave your lobby? What would you do if a former employee angrily confronted you over the reason for their dismissal? By running through these possible situations in your head, you're doing that kind of mental dress rehearsal, and can sort of prepare yourself better if it ever were to occur. So before I close today, I do want to end on a positive note, and I want everyone to reflect. We talked today about what our legal responsibilities are, what the required policies and procedures are, risk assessments, and personal behaviors. But we aren't starting from nothing. Every workplace is different and in different points of their safety process development. So I just want you to think to yourself, what policies or procedures are already in place at your workplace? Also think about what other controls are in place for your position. What keeps you safe at work? Or how do your supervisors or managers support employee safety? By reflecting on these questions, it gives us kind of a starting point, right? Most of us aren't starting from nothing. Most of us have some things already in place to keep our workplaces free from violence. So although there may be a lot of work to do, oftentimes by reflecting on what we already have kind of will give us a starting point. Okay, look at that, pretty much just on time. So that's my presentation for today. My contact information is up on the screen here, as well as our website. If you do have any questions or would like further guidance on this particular topic, like I said, you are very welcome to reach out, and either myself or one of our safety advisors would be happy to walk through that with you. We have lots of resources available on our website. We do have sample templates for violence prevention plans that you can use to get started. And I also believe, like I mentioned earlier, I did provide a resource to Nick, which should be distributed if it hasn't been already. So with that, I will open it up for any questions.
Sorry there, Laura, just getting back on here. Nothing has come up in the questions just yet, but just a reminder to everyone, if you do have any questions, just use that Q&A function just down at the bottom, and Laura will be able to answer them for us. Also, if you did not receive the slides, if you can just send myself, just drop it into the chat, your email, and just make sure you either send it to just the host or the panelist. We'll be able to see that, or I'll be able to see that, and then I'll be able to get that resource off to you guys there.
Hopefully the no questions means everything was covered.
I was just gonna say, someone's asking for a copy of the slides. Would you be willing to share your slide deck with us?
Yep, absolutely. Yep, I can send that out.
Okay. And then again, if you just send that over to myself, Laura, I can then go in and grab everyone's email address that has registered and attended for today, and then be able to send that out to everyone. So yeah, so that slide deck will be coming out, I'm going to say later this week. So watch for that in your emails. Perfect. I think you've done a fantastic job there with answering and kind of laying everything out, and thinking about the prevention plan and what it looks like moving forward. That I know myself, even just thinking about being here within our office, I know it's something that we don't talk about, and that we haven't really maybe discussed. So again, something that I can take back to my team and say, hey, have we thought about this? What does this look like? We do get outside visitors that do come into our office. So, again, some food for thought to think of, how do we ensure that we are providing safety at all levels, not just, slips, trips, falls, and what that looks like for that. So, no, thank you so much, Laura, for all that information.
Yeah, of course. Happy to provide it.